For the thousands of refugees flooding into Gotenhafen, East Prussia, on January 30th, 1945, the MV Wilhelm Gustloff must have looked like a lifeline, a 180-foot-tall beacon of salvation in the face of the advancing Red Army. But shortly after 9 p.m. that evening, as the great ship steamed out onto the frigid waters of the Baltic Sea, she became a sitting duck, a vast floating target for the enemy that stalked her beneath the waves. And once that enemy found her, she became a tomb. Struck by 3 Soviet torpedoes, the Wilhelm Gustloff went to the bottom of the Baltic in less than an hour, taking perhaps 9,000 lives with her. Most of them civilians, many of them children. At least one of them just a few hours old, born that very evening aboard the ship. In the desperate scramble of World War II's final months, the worst single-ship maritime disaster in history went by almost unnoticed. Just another grim story in one of humanity's darkest chapters. Since then, however, the incident has been pored over by research. From her legitimacy as a target to the way in which she was loaded and operated, basically every aspect of this disaster has been the subject of debate, and it remains highly controversial. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Are we looking at a trigger-happy Soviet submarine crew targeting refugee ships to avenge Nazi atrocities in Russia? Or does the blame lie squarely with the Nazis? Did they callously shield their retreating troops behind civilian human shields and hope they'd get away with it? Hey, I'm Andy Roberts, and there are many unanswered questions about this one, and some are likely to remain unanswered. But with this video, we're going to try to get a little closer to the truth. 1945 dawned horribly for the Nazis. The Ardennes offensive, their last great push into the West, had started promisingly, but had fallen apart by Christmas of 1944. By January 3rd, they were on the retreat and rapidly running out of land to retreat into. With their backs to the Rhine and with their western borders constricting by the day, it was very nearly all over. In the east, it was no better. Punishing Red Army advances pushed German forces back and back into their own territory. Hitler, infuriated that his troops were giving up so much ground, announced the wave breaker strategy. Key strongholds like Kolberg, Königsberg, and Danzig could not be allowed to fall. The plan backfired. Rather than dulling the power of the Russian advance, holding these fortifications meant German troops were being encircled and essentially cut out of the war. Even worse, the entire province of East Prussia, from Danzig to Gdansk in the west to Goldap and the Lithuanian borderlands in the east, was about to be isolated. By mid-January, it was clear. East Prussia needed to be evacuated, and quickly. This meant men, material, auxiliaries, civilians, everything moved back westwards into Germany. But with only a narrow corridor linking the territory to the German heartland, this wasn't going to happen overland. Instead, the evacuation would need to take place by sea. The refugees streaming into Gotenhafen from across East Prussia must have known this. Now known as Gdynia, Poland, this seaport on Danzig Bay had become a fulcrum for Operation Hannibal, the desperate seaborne evacuation of a falling province. And so the civilians arriving here in the last week of January 1945 understood that this was it. If they couldn't get on board a ship, they'd be going nowhere. As survivor Hans Rittner recalled, they are farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, lawyers, university professors, all kinds, ordinary, average people. Most are silent, gaunt, hungry, sunken-eyed. They are ill-clothed, many without boots, wearing mufflers around their feet for warmth. The mood was tense on the docks as the Gustloff's second engineer, Walter Knust, looked out over the harbour. He estimated the crowd to be around 60,000. All praying for safe passage out of the province. The refugees were right to be terrified. When the Nazis advanced into Russia in the summer of 1941, they had committed horrendous atrocities, basically wherever they went. Whether driven by the Nazi crusade against the so-called Judeo-Bolshevism, or simply overtaken by the license to kill and maim, advancing German troops murdered 19 million Soviet civilians. Now, the Soviets were out for revenge. Stories began to filter through about what the Red Army was doing to civilians they caught as they swept across Eastern Europe. In East Prussia, hundreds of thousands of refugees fled in terror. the Soviets hot on their heels. Stragglers were shot out on the road, some even run over by tanks. But when those bedraggled refugees stumbled into the port of Gotenhafen, they were met with a cheering sight. The vast, comforting edifice of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, standing at the harbor, ready to whisk its passengers to safety. Some 685 feet long, 77.5 feet wide, and weighing almost 25,500 tons, the Gustloff was a leviathan. She looked every inch the cruise liner she'd been in a previous life, except her once sparkling white coloring was now painted a drab gray. Back in the 1930s, she'd been part of the Strength Through Joy program, which essentially meant hard-working, well-behaved Germans got treats like theater trips or cruises on the Baltic. Since then, she'd been a transport ship in the Spanish War, then a hospital ship, and then a floating barracks. She hadn't sailed since 1942, but now she was ready to take a lead role in Operation Hannibal. Under the dual command of civilian Captain Friedrich Petersen and Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, along with senior watch officer Captain Karl Kohler and Captain Heinrich Weller, she would transport her passengers west, first to Kiel, then to Flensburg in northern Germany. At some point on the morning of January 30th, the final phase of boarding began. The scene was a hectic one, as exhausted refugees fought to clamber aboard. Amid the pushing and shoving, some lost their balance. One man slips and falls into the harbor among the ice cakes. Hans Rittner remembered, people looking down at him in dazed apathy. A steward standing beside me shakes his head slowly. Among the jostling crowd were people who had made deals that they hoped would secure their passage. A pastor from a small East Prussian village church had petitioned the local authorities for favor. He'd lost 2 sons to the war, and the local Nazi command had taken pity on him, granting him 2 tickets. The pastor and his wife hurried to Gotenhafen to board their ship. His wife never made it. Her body is still buried somewhere out there by a roadside in the Polish countryside. Just how many of those 60,000 people actually made it on board, we cannot be sure. Gustloff was rated for 1,900 passengers and crew, but she was certainly well beyond this limit. When finally she cast off, sometime after noon, the official figures were 6,050 passengers, more than triple the Gustloff's capacity. But even as the fully laden Wilhelm Gustloff pulled away from the dock, she was pursued by an armada of small craft, each packed with refugees pleading to be allowed on board. The Gustloff's crew were sympathetic. The Danzig area was now surrounded by the enemy. Allied bombing raids had knocked out her power and the water supply. To stay here meant certain death. For the people now pleading to be allowed aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff was their only chance. So as the ship stalled in Danzig Bay, the crew dropped nets and helped people scramble up onto the deck. It was around 6 p.m. by the time she finally got on her way. Radio officer Rudy Lange would later say he believed an extra 2,000 people came aboard at this point. If Lange was right, that would push the number of passengers beyond 8,000. Some estimates are closer to 10,600. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not alone that afternoon. Another liner accompanied her, the Hansa, also packed with refugees and wounded troops. Alongside them were 2 torpedo boats. But when both Hansa and one of the torpedo escorts ran into trouble, they were forced to turn back. Gustloff would continue on her journey with just 1 torpedo boat by her side. Her crew were not worried, or at least not excessively so. For them, the key dangers were British planes and the networks of mines that bobbed about in the Baltic Sea. There wasn't much a torpedo boat could do against those threats anyway. But there was another threat the crew had neglected to account for. After the breakout at Leningrad a year earlier, and the Red Army's advance westward, the Soviets had control over large swathes of the Baltic. This means their subs could now operate freely, stalking enemy ships and posing a constant threat. One of those subs was the S-13 under Captain Alexander Marinesko. The S-13 had been at sea for nearly 20 days, sailing down from Hanko in Finland, skirting the coast of Sweden and then patrolling the shoreline of East Prussia. Aware of the chaotic evacuation going on at Gotenhafen, Marinesko had piloted his craft into the Bay of Danzig in search of easy targets. At the mouth of the bay, however, Marinesko and his crew noticed something behind them. It was the vast hulk of the Gustloff, now out on the open sea, illuminated in glistening lights against the dark winter sky. This was too good an opportunity to turn down. For close to an hour, the S-13 stalked the Gustloff, remaining in the shallow water between the ship and the shore. They would not expect an attack from this direction, Marinesco later said. Their watch would be concentrating on looking out to sea. The S-13 got in close, within a kilometer by some accounts. They loaded up 4 torpedoes, each painted with its own message from the S-13's crew. There was, "For the motherland, for the Soviet people, and for Leningrad," the latter commemorating the siege that had claimed close to 1 million lives. Finally, the 4th torpedo marked for Stalin. From here, they couldn't miss. With the Gustloff lit up like a Christmas tree, S-13 took aim and fired. Those on board the Gustloff had been blissfully unaware of the danger. It was only when the first torpedo, Motherland, smashed into her near the bow that those on board understood what was going on. Irene, 11 at the time of the sinking, remembered that first impact. "We were wearing life jackets and packed into the salon just underneath the uppermost deck," Irene said. "About 9 p.m, we felt a thud and the ship listed. The room was emptied of all furniture except the grand piano, which started to roll towards us. Mother took our hands, and we made our way as quickly as possible upstairs, where we hung on the rails until we felt 2 more hits. Those 2 more hits were the 2nd and 3rd torpedoes, Soviet people and Leningrad slamming into the ship. The 2nd struck at midships, while the 3rd shattered the engine room just below the ship's single funnel, knocking out her electrical power. There was no 4th blast. The remaining torpedo, for Stalin, had misfired and remained in its tube. The mechanism of the S-13, perhaps more interested in avenging Soviet deaths than honoring their famously erratic leader. The triple impact of the torpedoes knocked the Gustloff off balance. Like a boxer taking a heavy shot to the head, she reeled backwards, rolling to starboard, before finding her feet once again and steadying herself. But the damage had been done, and now water was pouring in on the port side. The roll to port, slower but far more critical for the Gustloff. As the ship tilted, thousands of passengers were thrown into disarray. Alarm bells blared out, but no lights to show the way. The Gustloff turned into a nightmare below decks. Some fell, crushed and trampled under panicked feet. Some simply fled the wrong way, running deeper into the bows of the ship that was pitching towards the bottom of the Baltic. Up above, passengers began to clamber into lifeboats. There were probably boats enough for around 5,060 people. This meant 1,000 people, at the absolute least, and probably quite a few more, were going to be braving the icy waters of the Baltic without one. The ship's crew had managed to get the PA system up and running, so passengers heard reassuring messages as they plunged into the dark waters. The crew did not manage to get the main radio working, and instead relied on an emergency transmitter to raise the alarm. With a range of only 2 kilometers, this was essentially useless. Even when the escorting torpedo boat relayed the message, boosting its range, it did so at the wrong frequency. Valuable minutes slipped by, with the Gustloff transmitting its message out into the void. By now, it was clear there was no saving the Gustloff. The ship's officers busied themselves with destroying her classified papers as Lieutenant Commander Zahn watched on. One tale emerging from the sinking concerns a steward who served the officers cognac as they worked, so they could enjoy one final drink together as the ship went down. Seeing as Zahn, Peterson, Conler, and Weller all survived, they probably needn't have bothered. Just before the ship went under, something strange happened. The generators, long swamped with water, suddenly reactivated, illuminating the stricken vessel as she slipped beneath the waves. Historian Chaglions believes this may have been caused by a boiler exploding, which then flushed and jump-started the generators. But it was too late for passengers still on board. The sudden flood of light just meant that those in the lifeboats could witness the plight of the people still on deck as they lived out their final panicked moments. "I could clearly see people still on board, clinging to the rails," Paula Nust remembered. "Even as she went under, they were still hanging on and screaming. All around us were people swimming or just floating in the sea. I can still see their hands grasping at the side of our boat." The Gustloff was struck just after 9 p.m, and in less than an hour she'd plunged to the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Shortly after that, the cruiser Admiral Hipper, having finally received the Gustloff's distress signal, joined the Gustloff's torpedo boat at the scene, and the hunt for survivors began. It was a bitter January night with air temperatures as low as -10 Celsius. It was impossible to survive for long in the water. Rescuers did manage to pull 1,063 people out of the sea, although many of these would not live. As no one is clear on just how many people were on board, we've no idea how many lives were lost. At the very least, the death toll is 5,000, and maybe above 9,000. Two things are true here. It's true that between January 25th and January 30th, the port authority at Gotenhafen packed thousands of civilians onto a boat carrying military personnel and sent them out onto the Baltic to be slaughtered. It is true, on the evening of the 30th, a Soviet submarine crew went out looking for an easy kill and found one. In the afternoon of the sinking, there was no uproar or backlash. Marinesco and his men had done exactly what they were supposed to do. Once they'd sent the Wilhelm Gustloff to the seabed, S-13 returned to its patrol. In February, just weeks after the Gustloff sinking, Marinesco set his sights on another former liner, the MV Steuben. Again, the S-13 fired, and again it made its escape, leaving 4,000 dead in its wake. After the war, the S-13 was granted the accolade Red Banner, and Marinesco plus his crew were awarded Order of the Great Patriotic War. In 1990, Marinesco's decoration was posthumously upgraded to Hero of the Soviet Union. Operation Hannibal continued until the end of the war and was targeted repeatedly by the Allies. In April 1945, Marinesco's colleague Vladimir Konovalov, captain of the submarine L3, would kill more than 6,000 people when he torpedoed the MV Goya. On May 3rd, less than a week before the end of the war, British Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers swooped down on the MV Capricorn and MV Thielbeck as they sat more defenselessly in Neustadt Bay. The combined death toll was possibly as high as 7,000. Many of those killed were concentration camp prisoners, days away from surviving their ordeal. So the Germans were victims of Allied war crimes? Well, possibly. But they'd shown themselves to be just as capable of their own barbarity out on the high seas. When Lancastria sailed to St. Nazaire to rescue British soldiers from Dunkirk in 1940, she may have picked up as many as 7,000 retreating troops. She was bombed on her journey back across the Channel, and wounded survivors were strafed in the waters by German planes. Many of the details of the Lancastria disaster are still unknown. The documents will remain classified until 2040, but the death toll was enormous. And the Soviets themselves had experienced just how brutal German forces could be at sea. While the MV Armenia made the short hop along the Crimean coast between Yalta and Gurzov in 1941, she believed she was in no danger. She was painted with Red Cross insignia and was very obviously a hospital ship. This made no difference to the German Heinkel bombers who spotted her, however. The horrendously overloaded Armenia sank in just 4 minutes, taking somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people down with her. Nazi Germany had shown no mercy to shipping throughout the war, so Soviet submarines like Marinesco's had no reason to hold back once they'd gained the upper hand. And when we consider who was actually on board the Gustloff and how the Gustloff was presented, the situation becomes even murkier. Researcher and Gustloff survivor Heinz Schorn believed that there were 8,956 refugees on board, as well as 918 submariners of the Unterseeboot Lehr Division. On top of this, there were 373 female naval auxiliary helpers, plus 173 naval armed forces auxiliaries. Finally, Schorn believed that there were 162 severely wounded soldiers on board. While we can't be sure that Schorn had his numbers correct, he does seem to be right about the categories of the passengers. Female Naval Auxiliary Commander Wilhelmina Reicht confirmed that her personnel were on board. Because road and rail transport was so dangerous at the time, it was considered best to send these girls on the Gustloff, she said. The auxiliaries were all between 17 and 25 years old, and we gave seaborne priority to those who had family or other responsibilities. The presence of these submariners is also confirmed. Evacuating these trainees had been the Gustloff's primary order. The civilian rescue mission was only added to the remit when refugees began overwhelming Gotenhafen. This meant the Germans were knowingly transporting military personnel on board the Wilhelm Gustloff, well aware that this made the ship a target. The authorities kept on loading up the Gustloff with refugees, essentially sending them to their deaths. Not only was Gustloff carrying military personnel, she'd been actively converted into a combat vessel. While she maintained the profile of an ocean liner, she bristled with anti-aircraft guns. Useless against a submarine, but still very much the weaponry of a warship. She was also painted grey, delineating that she was not a hospital ship or a non-combatant, but a military transport. Disturbingly, this military focus may be reflected in the way the victims were rescued. Author Sergei Glazarov addressed the complex legacy of the Gustloff sinking, states that half the total survivors were military personnel, despite military personnel making up only 20% of the numbers of passengers. Among the refugees, Glazarov says, the survival rate was 5%. Among the submariners, it was 50%. Perhaps these submariners were well trained and better equipped to deal with the chaos of a sinking ship, or maybe these valuable military assets simply became the priority for rescuers. We'll never know for sure. In fact, there's a lot of things we cannot know for sure about the Wilhelm Gustloff. In the death throes of the Second World War, even a disaster of this magnitude was relegated to the status of footnote. Just another tragedy in a seemingly endless list of them. And so many of the details of what happened to the ship are lost to history. What is clear is civilian lives were sold cheaply that night in January 1945. The Nazi commanders, desperate to save their submariners, paid little heed to the safety of the refugees on board. Eager to prevent valuable military assets falling into Soviet hands, these commanders sent the Gustloff on her way, barely defended, an easy target for submarines. And when the S-13 spotted her, Marinesco and his men were happy to do their duty. They showed no hesitation in pulling the trigger. To the Nazi and Soviet powers, these were just moves on a chessboard, strategic plays in a match nearing its endgame. But to the thousands of refugees fleeing their homes in East Prussia, desperate for a chance of survival, it meant gambling literally everything and losing it all in the unforgiving waters of the Baltic Sea.